The man screaming on his knees wasn't begging for his life. He was begging for time because the deal he broke 3 years ago had finally caught up with him. The warehouse sat just outside Genoa's commercial port, hidden among legitimate logistics companies that moved containers by day and silence by night. From the outside, it looked legal enough, registered, taxed, insured. Inside, consequences were being settled. Gabriele Dario stood a few feet away from the kneeling man, his hands relaxed, his suit untouched by the panic unfolding in front of him. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The room was quiet except for the man's breath breaking apart in uneven gasps. "Please," the man said again. "I fixed it. I corrected the numbers. It won't happen again." Gabriele looked past him, not at him, toward the open container behind them. Inside were stacks of falsified shipping documents and digital ledgers projected on a portable screen. Dates, routes, names. A rerouted consignment from 3 years ago, diverted through a secondary port and sold twice before reaching its intended buyer. The mistake hadn't cost money. It had cost reputation. "You didn't steal," Gabrielle said calmly. "You rearranged loyalty." The man shook his head violently. It was pressure. There was another offer. Everyone was doing it. Gabriele turned his gaze back to him then. Cold, measured, final. "Everyone," he replied, "is not my concern." This was how Gabriele ruled. Not with rage, not with spectacle, but with memory. In his world, betrayal didn't expire. It waited. It compounded interest. And when it returned cleanly. A nod. No words wasted. The sound that followed was brief and controlled. When the body fell, there was no applause, no shock, only relief among the men standing along the walls. Order had been restored. The books would balance again. Gabrielle adjusted his cuff and turned away as if nothing unusual had occurred. Outside, trucks moved in regulated lanes. Customs officers stamped manifests. The real world continued exactly as designed. A phone was handed to him as he walked. "From Johannesburg," his aide said. Encrypted line. Gabriele already knew who it was. He took the call without stopping. "Speak." "The proposal has been revised," the voice on the other end said. "Smooth, controlled, powerful. My principal believes it's time to close old wounds." Gabriele allowed himself a small, humorless breath. 3 years ago, closing wounds had cost him 40 men and 2 burned ports. The memory was still visible in his balance sheets, rerouted trade, increased security premiums, political favors owed instead of owned. "And what does your principal offer this time?" Gabriele asked. There was a pause. Just long enough to signal calculation. Trust. Gabriele stopped walking. In the distance, cranes lifted containers marked for destinations across Europe and Africa. Global trade, global crime. The same rules applied to both, only enforcement differed. "Trust," Gabriele repeated, tasting the word like something expired, "is not an asset. There will be a gesture," the voice continued, "a sign of good faith. His daughter will travel under our protection. No weapons, no leverage." Gabriele's eyes narrowed slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition. A daughter. Symbols were useful. They were also fragile. "When?" he asked. "Within the week." The call ended. Gabriele stood still for a moment longer, listening to the rhythm of the port, the machinery, the distance, the illusion of neutrality. Then he turned back toward the warehouse, where the body was already being removed and the floor washed clean. Peace was being offered again, and Gabriele knew, with absolute certainty, that someone had already decided who would pay for it. In his world, that decision was never accidental. The man screaming on his knees wasn't begging for his life. He was begging for time because the deal he broke 3 years ago had finally caught up with him. The warehouse sat just outside Genoa's commercial port, hidden among legitimate logistics companies that moved containers by day and silence by night. From the outside, it looked legal enough, registered, taxed, insured. Inside, consequences were being settled. Gabriele Dario stood a few feet away from the kneeling man, his hands relaxed, his suit untouched by the panic unfolding in front of him. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The room was quiet except for the man's breath breaking apart in uneven gasps. "Please," the man said again. "I fixed it. I corrected the numbers. It won't happen again." Gabriele looked past him, not at him, toward the open container behind them. Inside were stacks of falsified shipping documents and digital ledgers projected on a portable screen. Dates, routes, names. A rerouted consignment from 3 years ago, diverted through a secondary port and sold twice before reaching its intended buyer. The mistake hadn't cost money, it had cost reputation. "You didn't steal," Gabriele said calmly. "You rearranged loyalty." The man shook his head violently. "It was pressure. There was another offer. Everyone was doing it." Gabriele turned his gaze back to him then. Cold, measured, final. "Everyone," he replied, "is not my concern." This was how Gabriele ruled. Not with rage, not with spectacle, but with memory. In his world, betrayal didn't expire. It waited, it compounded interest, and when it returned cleanly. A nod. No words wasted. The sound that followed was brief and controlled. When the body fell, there was no applause, no shock, only relief among the men standing along the walls. Order had been restored. The books would balance again. Gabriele adjusted his cuff and turned away as if nothing unusual had occurred. Outside, trucks moved in regulated lanes. Customs officers stamped manifests. The real world continued exactly as designed. A phone was handed to him as he walked. "From Johannesburg," his aide said. "Encrypted line." Gabriele already knew who it was. He took the call without stopping. "Speak." "The proposal has been revised," the voice on the other end said. "Smooth, controlled, powerful. My principal believes it's time to close old wounds." Gabriele allowed himself a small, humorless breath. 3 years ago, closing wounds had cost him 40 men and 2 burned ports. The memory was still visible in his balance sheets: rerouted trade, increased security premiums, political favors owed instead of owned. "And what does your principal offer this time?" Gabriele asked. There was a pause, just long enough to signal calculation. "Trust." Gabriele stopped walking. In the distance, cranes lifted containers marked for destinations across Europe and Africa. Global trade, global crime, the same rules applied to both, only enforcement differed. "Trust," Gabriele repeated, tasting the word like something expired, "is not an asset. There will be a gesture," the voice continued, "a sign of good faith. His daughter will travel under our protection. No weapons, no leverage." Gabriele's eyes narrowed slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition. A daughter. Symbols were useful. They were also fragile. "When?" he asked. "Within the week." The call ended. Gabriele stood still for a moment longer, listening to the rhythm of the port, the machinery, the distance, the illusion of neutrality. Then he turned back toward the warehouse, where the body was already being removed and the floor washed clean. Peace was being offered again, and Gabriele knew, with absolute certainty, that someone had already decided who would pay for it. In his world, that decision was never accidental. Zuri Lethabo had learned early that safety was curated. It wasn't something spoken about in her family, it was arranged. Cars arrived before she stepped outside, routes changed without explanation, faces appeared and disappeared around her life with professional neutrality. She was never told she was in danger, only that certain rules existed because the world was complicated. She accepted that, until the rules started changing. Her flight into Milan was private, quiet, efficient, no press, no ceremony. Just paperwork signed in advance and a corridor cleared before her feet touched the ground. The men who met her did not introduce themselves. They didn't need to. Their posture said everything. Controlled, alert, not curious. This was not hospitality, it was containment. As the car moved through the city, Zuri watched Milan unfold through tinted glass. Beautiful, structured, expensive, a city built on order. It reminded her uncomfortably of the way her father ran things, everything polished on the surface, ruthless underneath. "Where exactly are we going?" she asked. One of the men in front glanced at her in the mirror. A secured residence, temporary. Temporary was a word that carried weight in her world. It meant nothing was guaranteed. When they arrived, the building looked ordinary enough, modern, discreet, indistinguishable from corporate housing. Inside, however, every detail was intentional. Cameras embedded into corners. Windows reinforced. Movement restricted by design. Zuri wasn't frightened. She was irritated. "This isn't a visit," she said aloud, more to herself than to anyone else. "No," a calm voice replied from behind her. "It isn't." She turned. Gabriele Dario stood a few steps inside the room, his presence unannounced, his expression unreadable. He did not smile, he did not posture. He observed like a man assessing balance in a room already weighed down by history. Zuri met his gaze without hesitation. "So you're the man my father believes will keep the peace," she said. Gabriele studied her carefully. Not her appearance, her composure, the absence of fear. The precision of her words. "I'm the man who understands why he sent you," Gabriella replied. "And why is that?" she asked. "Because weapons escalate," he said, "but people complicate." Zuri absorbed that quietly. "My father said this was about trust." Gabrielle's expression didn't change. "Then he underestimated you." That was the moment Zuri understood something important. This man wasn't pretending. He wasn't trying to impress or intimidate her. He was speaking to her as if she were already part of the equation. "You know I'm not here by choice," she said. "I know," Gabriella answered, "which is why you're dangerous." The word landed heavier than any threat. Over the next hours, Zuri noticed details others missed. How staff deferred to Gabriella without instruction. How silence carried authority. How no one touched her phone, but access to outside communication quietly disappeared. This wasn't imprisonment. It was positioning. Later that evening, she stood alone on the balcony, overlooking the city lights. Somewhere far away, deals were being discussed using her presence as reassurance. Her father had placed her between two empires and called it peace. Zuri exhaled slowly. She wasn't naive enough to believe she was protected, but she was intelligent enough to know she was being watched. Behind her, unseen, Gabriella reviewed security feeds and behavioral reports, not because he distrusted her, but because he trusted patterns, and Zuri Lethabo did not behave like a pawn. She behaved like someone who would eventually ask the wrong questions. In wars like theirs, that was how everything changed. Control was easiest when distance existed. Proximity changed calculations. Gabriele Dario did not avoid Zuri Lethabo, but he did not seek her out either. Their interactions were deliberate, scheduled, monitored, bounded by structure. Meals were shared at opposite ends of long tables. Conversations happened in rooms designed for surveillance, not comfort. Nothing was left to chance. And yet, proximity had its own intelligence. Zuri noticed it first. She noticed how routes within the residence subtly shifted depending on where she spent time, how security patterns adjusted not around threats, but around her presence. She was not being guarded like a guest. She was being balanced like a variable. One evening, she broke routine. Instead of returning to her assigned wing after dinner, she walked into the adjoining study, an unspoken boundary. The room smelled faintly of leather and old paper. Maps lined one wall. Financial reports occupied another. This was not a personal space, it was an operational one. Gabriele was already there. He did not look surprised. "You're early," he said, eyes still on the document in his hands. "You changed the schedule," Zuri replied. "Dinner ended 10 minutes sooner." Gabriele set the file down slowly. Observation is a liability in some environments, only if you don't understand what you're observing. He finally looked at her then. Not challengingly. Assessing. "You've been trained," he said. Zuri shook her head. "No, I've been around power long enough to know when it's being managed instead of displayed." That answer stayed with him longer than it should have. They spoke then not about peace, not about fathers, not about negotiations. They spoke about systems, about how cities were fed, about how oil moved, about why chaos was bad for business but fear was efficient. It was not flirtation. It was alignment testing. "You don't romanticize what your father does," Gabriele observed. "I don't excuse it," Zuri replied. "There's a difference." Silence followed, not awkward, measured, Outside, Milan moved on. Inside, something subtle shifted. Zuri began to notice restraint where she expected intimidation. Orders given once, not repeated. Violence discussed as cost, not expression. Gabriella did not justify his choices, but he did not hide them either. That unsettled her. "You believe consequence is cleaner than mercy," she said later. "No," Gabrielle answered. "I believe mercy without consequence is a lie." It was the closest thing to a confession she had heard from him. Their proximity remained controlled, but the distance between assumptions narrowed. Guards no longer hovered when they spoke. Doors were left open longer than protocol demanded, small allowances, invisible to anyone not trained to notice them, and still nothing was promised. One afternoon, Zuri was shown a shipment log by mistake. Dates jumped out at her, a supplier name repeated across years. "This one," she said, pointing. "Why does it keep reappearing after sanctions?" The analyst froze. Gabriella took the tablet without comment, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. "That's not your concern," the analyst said quickly. Gabriella raised a hand. "It is now," he said. Zuri watched the exchange carefully. She hadn't accused, she hadn't pried, she had simply noticed. Later, alone, Gabriella reviewed the supplier file in full. The pattern was older than he remembered, connected to the first failed piece, to men who had vanished, to roots that had cost him dearly. Zuri's presence hadn't caused the disturbance. It had revealed it. That night, as she stood again on the balcony, Zuri felt the atmosphere change. Not fear, not tension, focus. Behind her, unseen, Gabriele adjusted protocols not to restrict her, but to prepare for something he could now sense approaching. Controlled proximity had done its work, and somewhere in the systems both men relied on, movement had begun quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. The hit did not announce itself with chaos. It arrived disguised as routine. The evening schedule was ordinary by design, limited movement, predictable timing, a short drive between secured locations. Milan traffic complied, security spacing was textbook. If anyone was watching, it would have looked safe enough to ignore. That was the point. Gabriella Dario sat in the rear seat, eyes forward, hands still. Across from him, Zuri Lethabo reviewed a message on a secured device, permission granted for a brief public appearance the following day. Symbolic, harmless, necessary for optics. She looked up. "This feels rushed." "It is," Gabrielle said. "Which is why it's happening." The car slowed at a controlled intersection. A delivery truck edged forward on the right, registered, scanned, cleared earlier that day. The driver's face was neutral, bored, even. Gabrielle's instincts tightened. "Driver," he said calmly. "Hold." The words barely landed before the truck lurched. Metal screamed. Glass exploded. The impact spun the convoy sideways, pinning one vehicle against a barrier. Sound fractured into sharp pieces, shouts, alarms, the unmistakable crack of suppressed fire. Gabrielle moved first. The door flew open as he pulled Zuri down and out, shielding her with his body as rounds tore through the air, where she had been sitting seconds earlier, concrete chipped. A second attacker emerged from behind the truck, wrong shoes, wrong posture, weapon raised, too smoothly for coincidence. Security responded instantly, but this wasn't random violence. It was timed, measured, a narrow window engineered for maximum damage. Zuri felt the heat before she heard the bullet, felt Gabrielle twist, shift, force her flat against the pavement as a round passed close enough to singe fabric. "Stay down," he said, voice steady, commanding. She didn't argue. The gunman fell. Another vanished into traffic chaos, already collapsing under police sirens and civilian panic. Within moments, the intersection became a sealed perimeter, blue lights reflecting off broken glass and spilled oil. Silence followed, heavy, charged. Zuri's breath came shallow, controlled. She was unhurt, but only because someone else had anticipated something going wrong before it did. Gabriella stood slowly, scanning the scene. His sleeve was torn, blood someone else's marked his cuff. "Was that—" Zuri began. "Yes," he said, cutting her off. "It was not a robbery, not intimidation, not spectacle. A message. Back at the residence, protocols locked down with surgical precision. No shouting, no panic, just motion. Analysts arrived, devices were seized, footage scrubbed and mirrored. Zuri sat alone in a secured room, hands folded tightly in her lap. Shock didn't hit her all at once. It came in waves, realizing how close death had been, how deliberate the timing was, how little chance had been involved. Gabriele entered quietly. "They weren't aiming for me," she said before he could speak. "No," he replied. "They were aiming through you." The truth landed hard. She looked at him then, not afraid, but searching. "My father wouldn't—" Gabriele said nothing. That silence did more damage than any accusation. Hours later, in a separate room, evidence assembled itself into an unmistakable shape. Weapon sourcing tied back to an old supplier. Logistics matched a route compromised years earlier. The signature was familiar, not sloppy, not bold. Confident. Gabriele stared at the data. Jaw set. This wasn't escalation. It was testing. Someone had wanted to see if he would hesitate, if emotion could be forced into his decision-making, if restraint could be turned into weakness. Zuri had been the measure. Outside, news outlets framed the incident as an attempted robbery gone wrong. The public accepted it easily. The real world preferred simple explanations. Inside the system, however, a line had been crossed. Gabriele closed the file and stood. "Find everyone connected to this supply chain," he ordered, quietly, no signals. "And the girl?" an aide asked. Gabriele's gaze hardened, not possessive, not emotional. "From this moment," he said, "she is no longer a symbol." In the next room, Zuri looked out at the city lights, understanding finally that safety had never been the point. She had been placed on a board already in motion, and now someone would pay for the move that missed. Truth rarely arrived all at once. It crept in through patterns. Zuri Lethabo was not interrogated after the attempt on her life. No one raised their voice at her. No one restricted her movements further than before. That, more than anything, unsettled her. In her world, silence usually meant decisions were being made without consent. She began to notice changes. Security rotated differently, now tighter, quieter. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms she had already been allowed to use. Analysts she had seen daily were replaced by faces that did not look at her at all. The system had not reacted emotionally. It had recalibrated. That told her the threat wasn't external. Late that night, sleep abandoned her. She moved through the residence without announcing herself, following corridors she had memorized over the past weeks. No alarms sounded. No one stopped her. Either this was permitted or it no longer mattered. She found the room by accident, or perhaps inevitability. The door was ajar. Inside, screens glowed with layered data shipping routes, financial flows, timestamps stacked like evidence waiting to speak. Gabriele stood at the center of it, jacket off, sleeves rolled, focused in a way that excluded everything else. He noticed her immediately. "You shouldn't be here," he said, not sharply, not gently. "Then lock your doors," Zuri replied. He studied her for a long moment, weighing something unseen. Then, without a word, he stepped aside. She walked closer. The data resolved itself. Supplier names repeated, routes she recognized from childhood travel ports her father favored, companies she'd heard mentioned at dinner tables under the guise of investments. One timestamp caught her attention. 3 years ago. Another followed, then another. "This wasn't recent. This network," she said slowly. "It predates the truce." "Yes," Gabriele answered. "And the weapon used," she continued, her voice tightening, "it wasn't new supply." "No." The realization didn't shatter her immediately. It compressed her chest, forced her to breathe deliberately. "Say it," she said. Gabriele did not soften his expression. He did not harden it either. "The authorization came from within your father's inner circle," he said. Directly. Zuri shook her head once. Not denial, rejection. "He wouldn't risk me." "He calculated you," Gabriele replied. "There's a difference." Silence fell heavy between them. Zuri's mind moved faster than her emotions. She replayed conversations, sudden schedule changes, her father's insistence that this visit was safe, his confidence that Gabriele would behave. He had known. Her hands curled into fists. He used me to test you, yes. To see if you would hesitate, yes. The word daughter had been replaced by leverage long before she boarded that flight. Zuri turned away from the screens, her reflection fractured across glass and light. So what now? She asked quietly. Gabriele's answer came without hesitation. Now I dismantle his system. You don't kill him, she said, not as a plea, but a statement. No, he agreed. That would be inefficient. She faced him again. And me? That, he said carefully, is the one variable he miscalculated. The weight of that settled slowly. Her father had assumed control, assumed predictability, assumed that blood guaranteed obedience. He had been wrong. Zuri stepped back, the room suddenly too tight for the thoughts forming in her head. I need time. You don't have much, Gabriele said. Once systems move, they don't pause. She nodded. Time had never been freely given in her life anyway. As she left, Gabriela turned back to the screens. Commands were already in motion, accounts flagged, intermediaries isolated, alliances quietly pressured. No announcements, no warnings. Across continents, doors would begin to close. In another city, far from Milan, Lethabo Enzokula slept soundly, believing his gamble had paid off, that fear had been introduced, restraint enforced. He did not yet realize that the moment he turned his daughter into a tool, he had triggered something far more dangerous than retaliation. He had activated consequence. The first collapse happened quietly. A mid-tier logistics firm in Marseille failed an audit it had passed for 12 consecutive years. No alarms, no headlines. Just a notice from regulators citing irregularities. Within 48 hours, its insurance coverage was suspended. Ships docked, cargo stalled, phones rang without answers. Gabriele Dario never issued a declaration. Declarations invited resistance. Instead, he moved through systems the way surgeons moved through flesh, precise, unemotional, irreversible. Compliance reviews were triggered in jurisdictions that prized procedure over loyalty. Credit lines tightened. Political favors expired at the exact moment they were needed most. This was not violence. This was consequence with paperwork. Zuri Lethabo watched from the edges, granted access to information without commentary. She recognized the pattern faster than anyone expected. Routes she'd traveled as a child now glowed red on digital maps. Companies her father once praised for efficiency began to vanish from ledgers overnight. You're collapsing him without touching him, she said one evening. Yes, Gabriela replied. Touching invites spectacle. She understood then that this was not revenge. It was correction. Across the corridor, analysts spoke in lowered tones. Messages arrived encrypted and left unanswered by choice. Allies of Lethabo and Zokole began calling not to threaten, but to negotiate separately. That alone told the story. Fear fractured unity. Isolation finished the rest. In Johannesburg, a minister withdrew support for a port expansion project, citing public pressure that hadn't existed the week before. In Durban, a storage facility failed safety inspection on grounds that could not be appealed. In Zurich, a trust account was flagged for enhanced review, a phrase that killed momentum without leaving fingerprints. Each move echoed an old tactic Lethabo himself had once used. Zuri noticed the symmetry. You're using his methods. I'm returning them, Gabriela said. Methods don't belong to people. They belong to patterns. Her phone buzzed for the first time in days. Father. She stared at the screen longer than she should have. When she answered, the voice on the other end sounded confident, too confident. You're safe, Lethabo Enzokule said, skipping pleasantries. That's all that matters. Safe, Zuri repeated. Is that what you call it? A pause. Brief. Calculated. This situation is temporary, he said. I need you calm. Did you authorize it? She asked. Silence stretched, then reshaped itself into justification. I authorized pressure, he replied. Not harm. You were never meant to be touched, but I was meant to be close enough, Zuri said. Close enough to slow him down. Another pause. Longer this time. You don't understand how this world works, Lethabo said. I do now, she answered, and ended the call. When she told Gabriele, He did not react outwardly. No satisfaction, no anger, only confirmation. Pressure reveals priorities, he said. He chose his. The silent war accelerated. Intermediaries defected. Not dramatically, quietly. They cited risk exposure and market volatility, language that meant self-preservation. One by one, Lethabo's buffers dissolved, not because Gabriele demanded it, but because the system no longer protected them. Zuri felt the emotional weight catch up to her then. Not grief, not rage, disillusionment. He believes he's still in control, she said. He is, Gabriele replied, just not of outcomes. That night, Gabriela authorized the final phase. No violence, no leaks, just alignment. Regulators moved where they were permitted, banks complied where they were obligated, partners retreated where they were vulnerable. By morning, Lethabo and Zokule's empire would still exist technically, but it would be exposed. Zuri stood by the window, city lights reflecting off glass like fractured stars. She had crossed an invisible line, no longer shielded by ignorance, no longer protected by blood. Behind her, Gabriela reviewed confirmations coming in from 3 continents. The war had never needed bullets. It needed patience. And now, it was ending the only way it ever truly could, with power discovering its limits. Power did not collapse loudly. It thinned first. Zuri felt it before she saw it, an absence where certainty used to live. Calls that once came hourly, now arrived once a day, then not at all. Names. Her father spoke with authority were suddenly replaced by phrases like unavailable, review pending, legal exposure. The language of control had shifted into the language of delay. That was how empires bled. The meeting took place in a neutral building, glass, steel, and security designed to feel impartial. Zuri arrived alone. No escorts, no handlers. Her father had insisted. It was meant to look like confidence. Lethabo and Zokule stood when she entered. He smiled the way he always had measured, reassuring, practiced over decades. "You look well," he said. Zuri didn't return the smile. "You look tired." The words landed harder than accusation. They sat across from each other, a table between them that felt symbolic, now distance made formal. Outside, traffic flowed uninterrupted. The real world had no interest in their reckoning. "You shouldn't be here," Lethabo said. "This situation is unstable." "You made it unstable," Zuri replied calmly. He leaned back slightly. "I made it necessary." That was the moment she saw it clearly, not cruelty, not madness, but conviction without restraint. "You approved the pressure, knowing I would be close," she said. "You measured risk and decided I was acceptable loss." "I decided you were protected by intelligence," he said sharply. "By predictability." "By him," Zuri corrected. "You assumed he would hesitate." Lethabo's jaw tightened, and he did. Zuri shook her head. "No." He adapted. Silence filled the space between them. Not anger. Calculation failing to produce certainty. "You taught me that power is preparation," Zuri continued. "But you never taught me that preparation can turn inward." Lethabo's phone vibrated on the table. He ignored it, then it vibrated again. This time, he checked. Something shifted in his eyes, not fear, but recognition. "They're freezing accounts that aren't even in my name," he said quietly. Zuri nodded. "You taught them how." For the first time, irritation cracked through his control. "You think this is justice?" he demanded. "This is opportunism. The world doesn't reward morality, it rewards dominance." "No," Zuri said. "It rewards timing, and yours is gone." The meeting ended without shouting, without reconciliation, without closure. That was the cruelest part. When Lethabo stood to leave, his posture was unchanged, but something essential had detached. The man who walked out was still powerful on paper, still influential in memory, but no longer protected by inevitability. Later that night, Zuri stood beside Gabriela in the residence overlooking Milan. Neither spoke at first. They didn't need to. "He justified it," she said eventually. "He always would," Gabriela replied. "People don't betray their logic. They betray their limits." "And you?" she asked. "What do you justify?" Gabriella considered the question longer than necessary. I justify systems, he said, because systems end arguments. Below them, the city glowed with quiet obedience, law-abiding on the surface, negotiated underneath. What happens to him now? Zuri asked. He will survive, Gabrielle said, but he will answer questions for the rest of his life. She absorbed that slowly. Death would have been simpler, quicker, final. This was consequence. Zuri turned back toward the window. You didn't do this for me. No, Gabrielle said honestly. But I didn't exclude you either. That distinction mattered more than comfort. As confirmations arrived, resignations, withdrawals, sealed indictments, Zuri understood something final. Her father had not fallen because of enemies. He had fallen because the world he mastered had learned from him. And somewhere between loyalty and truth, she had chosen to stop pretending that blood outweighed consequence. The empire did not explode. It dissolved, and in its absence, something irreversible had begun. The city did not notice the end. Milan woke the next morning exactly as it always did, trams on schedule, cafes opening with practiced precision, markets adjusting prices based on movements no one questioned. There were no headlines announcing the collapse of a transcontinental empire. No sirens, no public reckoning. That was how power truly ended without ceremony. Zuri Lethabo stood alone on the balcony, the early light washing the city in muted gold. She had slept little. Not because of fear, but because clarity refused to soften. Everything she had believed to be permanent protection, loyalty, inheritance, had revealed itself as conditional. Behind her, Gabriele Dario reviewed the final reports. Accounts frozen beyond appeal, political immunity stripped through technicalities too dense for public outrage, partners distancing themselves not out of fear, but survival. Lethabo Enzekula was still alive, still free, but permanently exposed. A man without insulation. Gabriella closed the last file and stepped outside. It's done, he said. Zuri nodded. She had known it before he spoke. Power had a way of announcing itself when it left through silence, through absence, through the sudden stillness of things that once demanded attention. What happens next? She asked. For him, Gabrielle said. He adapts or disappears. And for you? He met her gaze fully now, not as a strategist, not as a ruler, as a man who understood consequence too well to lie. I return to equilibrium, he said. I reinforce what was weakened. I prepare for the next challenge. She considered that. You never stop. No, he agreed. Neither do you. The statement surprised her not because it was wrong, but because it acknowledged her transformation without claiming ownership of it. Zuri leaned against the railing. You know I can't go back. I know, Gabrielle said. And I won't ask you to stay. That, more than any promise, was the truth she trusted. For a long moment they stood without speaking. No declarations, no reassurance, the kind of silence that existed only between people who understood the cost of words. I don't need protection, Zuri said finally. I wouldn't offer it, Gabriella replied. Only alignment. She smiled faintly at that. Alignment meant shared risk, shared consequence, no illusions. Below them, the city moved forward, unaware that supply lines had shifted, that invisible hands had changed position. The real world continued, indifferent to who paid the price for its stability. Zuri turned toward him. You let him live. Yes. Why? Gabrielle didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet. Because death would have ended his story, he said. This way, he has to live inside it. She understood then that mercy had never been part of the equation, only permanence. As the day unfolded, messages arrived for Zuri as well, some cautious, some curious, some desperate. People recalibrating their understanding of who she was, now that her father's shadow no longer protected or defined her. She did not answer them. Not yet. That evening, she packed lightly. No escorts waiting, no enforced itinerary. Gabrielle watched without comment. You could disappear, he said. I could, she replied, but that would mean he still chose my direction. He nodded once. When she stopped at the doorway, she looked back at him not for permission, not for reassurance. This wasn't a rescue, she said. No, Gabriella agreed. It was a reckoning. She stepped forward and kissed him, not urgently, not desperately. It was not a promise. It was acknowledgement. Then she left. Gabriele remained where he was, watching the door close, the city continuing its quiet negotiations outside. Something had ended. Something else had survived. Not love as fantasy. Not power as domination. But choice made with open eyes, in a world that punished blindness. And in that, both of them had finally won something no empire could guarantee.